I recall a moment when the realization struck me how a person, radiating potential danger, could skillfully bypass everyone's vigilance, including my own. The setting was a boardroom in the autumn of 2012. A mid-level executive, possessing an almost unassuming charm, subtly influenced the atmosphere with his phrasing of decisions and minor disagreements. I observed, with a degree of disbelief, as 3 seasoned directors, each boasting decades of experience, concurred with suggestions that slowly eroded their own authority. The telltale signs were discernible. The executive's smiles were timed perfectly, compliments lingered just a tad too long to maintain comfort, and facts were framed as if originating from the directors themselves. But no one, not myself or them, identified the manipulation until it had already succeeded. Psychologists might label this as the illusion of transparency, but its manifestation is far more subtle. Back in 1961, Solomon Asch conducted his well-known conformity experiments, where participants were asked to compare line lengths. Even when a single individual insisted on the incorrect line, a considerable portion of the group followed suit, essentially denying what their own eyes perceived. In that instant, rationality succumbs to subtle social pressure. I have witnessed such dynamics in corporate mergers, political debates, and even within families. Intelligent, educated individuals, fully capable of complex reasoning, suddenly agree to propositions that would seem illogical to any outside observer. Supposedly, the justification often lies in the pursuit of social cohesion or the avoidance of conflict, but such explanations fail to account for the almost invisible influence of the orchestrator, a ghost shaping the outcome amidst the general discourse. Consider a situation from 2009 involving a tech company, which I'll keep unnamed. A junior analyst, barely 24, managed to persuade 3 vice presidents to commit to a product launch schedule that was logistically unsound. She didn't need to yell or strong-arm anybody. Her technique was subtle. She would ask the right question at the right time, rephrasing risk as opportunity. She leaned on phrases like "we all agree" or "we're already behind," promoting a sense of agreement while concealing her own influence. By the end of the quarter, she was leading the meeting, with her superiors defending options that they hadn't realized were hers. Observing this, I remember thinking, this is beyond pure intelligence or competence. It's a combination of sharp observation, impeccable timing, and the skill to exploit the weaknesses of others. And I could not help asking myself, why are we, who are so trained in logic and negotiation, being so blind to it? There's something else to consider as well. In 2005, within a political think tank, I saw a strategist whose mere presence changed the flow of conversation. He wasn't loud, didn't take over debates. Instead, he used pauses and selective agreement, allowing others to fill in the blanks. During meetings, I took note how people would start using his phrases, mentioning him as a source, even when his statements were repeating what they themselves had said. Social psychologists call it the chameleon effect, but its consequences on practical decision-making are severe. It's more than just imitation. It's the subtle alignment of others' intentions to your own, without command. And most people never notice it because it feels voluntary, almost flattering. What I find most surprising is that intelligence offers no defense. Sometimes it can even be used against us. A 1989 study at the University of California observed MBA students participating in simulated corporate deals. The most sharp participants, those with the highest analytical scores, were constantly outdone by peers who emphasized perception, microexpressions, and selective sharing of information. The researchers reasoned it could be due to a cognitive weakness. Analytical minds expect to see rationality in others, and thus misinterpret deception as naivety or incompetence. I observed the same weakness in the boardroom. Someone's confidence in their analytical thought processes only enhanced their vulnerability to those who could manipulate information. is essentially a trap that you won't see until the effects appear. A contract is signed, a promotion reassigned, a decision everybody believes they were responsible for. And it's never quick or dramatic. The danger lies in the things that are unseen. Watching these things occur, I started to question myself. How many of the decisions I thought I fully trusted were being maneuvered by someone else's control? What does this say about how simple it is to manipulate others if it can happen right in front of educated adults? And yet, knowing all of this doesn't make things easier. There's a strange truth here. The very things that make someone dangerously smart are hidden until they've gained control. We like to imagine that we're careful and watchful, and that we can't be controlled. The data, however, paints a different picture. It makes me ask myself, if facts and experience aren't enough to protect us from power, then what rules those who fail to see it? I couldn't help but to continue thinking about the invisible levers of effect, how someone can tilt decision-making without raising concerns. That's when it hit me that what if the lever itself is wearing a mask? Morality, ethics, these are not shields, these are tools subtle and scary, for those know how to twist them. Take Stanley Milgram's experiments in 1963. Average people were instructed to cause shocks to others. 80% continued fully because a perceived authority mentioned it was the right thing to do. I always assumed that morality would act as a brake, but here it became an accelerator as the participants stated by helping science, they are contributing to make a higher purpose. And isn't that the trap? The same thing that makes us moral also makes us easy to control. I saw this in a corporate setting a few years back, in 2016 at a multinational tech company. A new approach was introduced, framed as protecting our customers and acting ethically. On paper, a noble goal became a way to force unwavering loyalty to management. Employees were driven to point out minor issues, accept choices, and report peers. Colleagues showed how being the ethical standard limited their autonomy, and I saw some managers find pleasure in this moral standard. No threats, just a quiet insistence that ethics require compliance. Morality itself became a weapon where few noticed until their own judgment had been compromised. Interestingly, this happens even in situations where social norms are involved. In the Stanford prison experiment in 1971, students were assigned to be guards and prisoners. The guards acted increasingly authoritarian, justifying it as necessary for order or for the good of the experiment. Observers recognized how they adopted a rationale for cruelty. It was no longer pushed from an outsider, the reasoning came from within. Morality, the reason why people change, can be used to control others. And the people doing it feel like they're doing the right thing. The moral instinct feels so malleable. I noticed this even with smaller things. At a consulting firm in 2012, an associate framed all aggressive advice as aligned with our values. Proposals that would have been stopped for being risky were given a chance just because they were wrapped in the language of ethics. The associates didn't consider themselves shady because they were protecting the right things, but the decisions quietly served someone else's plan. The associates thought they were doing the right things. The truth intensifies when authority and morality meet. I watched at a nonprofit board meeting in 2014 when someone introduced a new policy framed as fair and just. Everyone agreed with it and said implementing procedures that focused influence in one person's circle. A language of fairness made it hard to question. People who would normally challenge influence found themselves accepting obligations that they would otherwise consider to be shady. What stands out to me is the strange piece. If our compass can be used so easily, then what makes us act so fully? Patterns show ethical structures, when weaponized, are hard to resist. The bad part is we never see till the levers have swapped power. Morality isn't a safeguard. It's another area for silent action where the rules are more flexible than we admit. Even after seeing this, I saw how fear does the same work that morality does, only faster. Fear doesn't ask for consent, it hits rational thought before anyone recognizes it. I saw this in a negotiation in 2011 as a logistics company. A team was tasked with a plan to the board. One person hinted at layoffs without saying it directly. After 2 weeks, the managers agreed to proposals that hurt their own teams. Anxiety created compliance. I remember that with the experiments by Joseph Ledoux. Here, however, it wasn't a lab rat but a room full of professionals. Ledoux had said that fear triggers immediate action. If someone thinks that their place is at risk, they start to agree and justify actions. I noticed how a single pause could cause someone to give up. In a sales negotiation in 2013, I saw an executive stand still after a single comment about possible damage. The patterns repeat in companies. In a marketing department in 2015, managers were given goals framed as essential to company survival. People's productivity spiked not because they were extra. People realized their anxiety was woven into their mind. I spoke to one employee privately. She mentioned that she felt responding to strings she couldn't name. Rational minds tell it away, even as fear dictated their decisions. There's a moment when the emotional hold becomes invisible. In a 2014 corporate meeting, I saw someone use failure scenarios to cause managers to propose plans that they never considered. The scenario seemed calm, the language plausible, but it was existential. Fear didn't have to be shouted, so everyone began to believe. Even small things can add up. In 2012, during some kind of tech release, I saw an engineer agree to timelines after his project lead mentioned, "If this fails, we all know what that could mean for the team." His anxiety grew with every meeting, and soon he began making more choices. I believe every pattern I saw included fear. I realized it doesn't need justifying. That's what gets to me. Once fear becomes compliance, it keeps spreading. People start realizing it, showing it on others, and making it stronger. I've witnessed places where the threat of failure wasn't directly said, but it caused anxiety. People are smart, but they become more likely to fail. It shows that their smartness hurts more than helps them. How much control do we really have if this happens? Where do we actually have our own choices to make? Influence works through invisible strings where you were already moving. Gaslighting is a great example of this, where someone rewrites narratives around a candidate. Also, during this time, it makes their supporter doubt their own minds. Framing is an example of an invisible string. In the workplace, a VP will be seen to describe a missed release date not as a misstep, but as a chance that a team failed to meet. They made sure the teams felt like it was their choice and not that they were commanded. This is when you give selective data, and that's people start to agree with choices that help someone else. Election posts work this way as well to have a great influence. I saw a meeting at a tech office once where the manager wanted approval for an acquisition that was risky. The team finished each other's sentences, and soon the decisions became his. This isn't being nice or a good authority. It's a use of subtle time, small agreements, and a great deal of repetition. People become more defenseless because they forget how to have rational thoughts. Then comes in the group factor. In 2016, an organization began to use good names and small awards to make their members question some things. They wanted them to feel social and make a want to feel good in others' eyes. It made people anxious even though they know about this. This reminded of experiments where people would start to copy others and it would alter their behaviors. What surprised me the most was how regular the action felt like. People were moral, rational. The strings rarely mentioned them. In a set meeting, I noticed a team mentioning the terms as a win-win, making me believe that they were both in control. This act rarely gets named because it attacks who we are as people. Even knowing these strings, they can still be used on you. It makes you know that there's always some strings at play in casual conversations or social media. That's when it all made sense. It is action shaping ideas that has existed longer than we have known. It means that influence is everywhere. How many of the choices that bring us happiness do we quietly write? The invisible strings, the gentle shoves, and the careful timing finally made me realize. After we've been influenced, we begin to rationalize. It's very efficient. It makes people make choices that aren't theirs, and their heads weave a story where the action is all necessary. An example of this occurred in 2016, where analysts stated, "We don't have a choice." Even I began to think, that isn't their choice to begin with. The 1965 experiment involving Leon Festinger and James Carl Smith. Some were paid to say some actions were a blast while others were told to do a boring task. Those paid $1 enjoyed it more. To keep a sense of reasonableness, their minds aligned. I've noticed this in friend groups and the boards. Each time the mind creates explanations that are safe and reasonable. In 2014, I witnessed a corporate merger where a top-level manager gave consent to a supplier known for repeated failures to deliver on time. In a later private discussion, he told a fellow worker, "We needed things to stay the same. Switching suppliers would negatively impact everyone." What was missed was that no one considered asking the workers who depended on the supplier, as they were the ones who would bear the burden. Still, the manager had already come to terms with his decision. It wasn't mere self-deception. It was a well-thought-out explanation that hid control, postponed responsibility, and forced agreement from others. The family context also reveals similar dynamics. In one instance, siblings became the inheritors of a small business in 2010. One sibling made a deal independently that largely benefited a partner from outside the company. When questioned, she stated, "I aimed to protect the company's future." Over time, her brother, who was initially angry, began to agree, echoing the same explanation. Yes, she needed to plan ahead. This justification spread quickly, changing recollections and views so that the decision appeared to be mutually agreed upon, even though it was initially imposed by one person. It's surprising and frightening how swiftly people accept the idea of reason once a narrative has been established. Even small actions by managers can produce the same result. In a software startup in 2012, workers were pressured to agree to an ambitious schedule presented as a chance to those our skills. Despite feeling stressed and tired, team members justified it to each other, saying it was necessary, would help their careers, or would support the company long term. They persuaded themselves, even as they complained quietly, forgetting that the real reason was the leader's impulse to appear decisive to investors. Justification changed frustration and opposition into self-approval, altering manipulation into consent without anyone's realization. What concerns me most is that justification isn't just a response to actions. It comes before them. People expect the requirement to justify an action, influencing decisions subtly to satisfy an inner story even before the results appear. This makes influence almost unseen, nearly unstoppable, due to the participation of the target in creating their own compliance. Observing this in meetings, families, and social circles, I can't help but wonder, if we are so keen to rationalize our errors, how many seemingly independent choices are directed by others who subtly guide our justification in advance? I pondered the act of justification we all perform and noticed how it changes under stress when the stakes increase. So the distinction between right and wrong becomes unclear, that even intelligent, ethical individuals make choices that would shock them when calmer. In 2014, I investigated a tech entrepreneur who organized a merger that appeared extremely aggressive on the surface. The agreement involved quietly pushing aside a smaller partner, which was technically legal but ethically doubtful. Yet, the company's value doubled within months. Board members defended the actions, citing need, foresight, and long-term growth. Although workers talked about the methods used, the success story suppressed disapproval. I then understood that outcomes create their own moral excuse. If things are successful, they feel justified. There's a clear parallel in politics. In 1998, a campaign manager planned a series of negative ads that overdid a rival's mistakes. This approach verged on deception, yet the candidate won the election by a lot. People watching, including reporters, explained it away as rough politics or part of the game. I noted how normal voters accepted the outcome, their sense of right and wrong tweaked in reverse. The result, winning the election, made the means acceptable. Paradoxically, morality, which we believe to be without flexibility, bends to what's convenient, especially when everyone around us suggests that success is the real test of what is ethical. I've also seen related patterns in corporate talks. In 2012, a drug company sped up the approval process for a drug, reducing the severity of possible negative effects in presentations to the company. Managers who disagreed initially started reframing the data on the spot, stating, "We are defending patients by allowing their access," even though their doubts continued. By the time the board gave consent to start selling the drug, everyone had taken on the justification. Although the company technically defended its position and used moral terms, it really focused on being the top seller in the market. I didn't anticipate observing rational minds so smoothly matching obvious ethical risks with possibilities for personal and company profit. It's not limited to companies or politicians. I've seen siblings and family run businesses use unclear accounting or leave out key details to gain an advantage, convincing themselves they are preserving the family's heritage. In 2010, an oldest sibling quietly moved a small but important stream of income into a personal account, justifying it as an investment to help the business survive. The younger siblings, though initially upset, slowly began to justify the action too, citing strategic sight. The damage to their moral standards extended rapidly, covered up in collaborative thinking. It's interesting and worrisome to note how quickly ethical boundaries can change under pressure, especially when the perceived risks feel like matters of existence. Even individuals acting alone can fall into the same trap. In 2015, I spoke with a manager in the middle of the hierarchy who bypassed the regular steps to get supplies to secure a profitable contract. She mentioned she wouldn't act that way normally, though deadlines and demands from the higher positions created a mental place where cutting corners seemed like the most sensible option. She convinced herself at the end of the project that what she did had been necessary for the team to continue. This is where theory breaks down. Justification doesn't just happen after the action. It happens before, influencing the decision directly, so the person feels in control even as the ethical issue worsens. The puzzle I keep going back to is this: when results are used to measure morality, the methods of influence and deceiving oneself come together, and normal people can become involved in plans they would have refused under normal situations. Success, quick deadlines, stress, all make for an unclear environment where what is right and wrong is questionable. In such circumstances, influence becomes almost undetected. Seeing these patterns, I often ask myself, granted that our moral limits shift so easily when we face important stakes, to what extent are our choices influenced by practical needs, and to what extent are they subtly driven by the strategies of another? Reflecting on compromises, the justifications, led to a realization. These are not just isolated events. They have a relationship to each other. Single cases of manipulation, gaslighting, framing events, using fear, when repeated and applied across individuals and teams, create fixed ways of acting. Patterns turn into methods of doing things. In 2016, I examined a large company where fear and framing were incorporated at every level of management from the top down. By the approach of performance reviews each quarter, the workers were not merely affected by influence, they were active individuals in a carefully controlled setting, making choices that matched objectives that were barely known to them. The methods of control had become like invisible building parts. Historical examples back up the same ideas. All through the early 1930s in corporate Germany, business leaders created ways to motivate workers that hid control as measures to improve productivity. Workers were under the impression they were making choices, assessing their options, even having conversation about which tasks to complete. The structure made certain choices were in line with the goals. It wasn't just one mastermind, it was a network of standards, expectations, and input loops. Workers then started to have certain priorities, assuming those were self-commanded, not having any idea that the system had already decided what was okay to do. Here theory loses strength. Control does not have to have a charismatic personality or cause threats, but is often built into the structure. Observing the way organizations are set up currently, I've noticed the same idea is at play. In 2014, a startup in Silicon Valley put in place a system where workers would be responsible for each other's actions. Public approval, performance boards, and carefully structured emails pushed the staff to act in ways that were helpful for small positions of senior authorities. The staff thought they were acting voluntarily, defending the team's interests, or going after shared objectives. However, incentives, social approval, and fear of harming their image generated an outcome that was carefully coordinated even though there was no one giving commands directly. Staff came to adopt the system, became its representatives, and supported it unknowingly. Even social media acts of this kind. Algorithms make use of psychological strategies such as having opinions validated, limited coverage, and fear of being left out, and produce coordinated action to a serious degree. All through the election times in 2018, customized feeds push voters to repeat talking points, share content, and coordinate opinions without any planned action. Each individual had impression that they were acting on their own, logically or correctly. There was a group effort occurring. Although it may appear fascinating, it is quite concerned that influence can rise from individual manipulation up to group coordination. I also had an occasion to see smaller-scale applications in corporate context. In 2015, the sales representatives employed tactics, feedback loops, and time-based incentives to better decisions and conversation. The sales staff talked about which approach and the strategies that they believe were an exercise, yet the results showed to the manager's goals. Even internal arguments, when said, were redirected by the system aligning it with the same goals. The more competent and aware of the employee, the more effective was in incorporating their values into its system. What continues to come back to me is a paradox in which influence often hides in visibility and is rooted on the character. Guidelines, incentives, feedback, and repetition come together into systems that guide behavior at scale, changing independence into expected behavior. Those act within these systems feel enlightened or have independence or justification. The issue lingers. If control can be created within the system, making it unseen and independently reinforced, how many options considered ourselves predetermined rather than decided by our own judgment? I kept tracing the feelings, moral values, justification, and control to come to the clear point in which all actions are performed with the mind and body. In 2014, I watched a CEO who applied those lessons at a time. The CEO made the acquisition look ethical, applied subtle fear into negotiation, and structured incentives, making sure employees enforced even without command. By the end of the quarter, the system worked that had come from a single thought. This is not made up as strategists in campaign strategies use framework, moral perception, with fear in association. In 2016, a manager managed influence on voters across multiple states by leveraging selective framework and social approval. The strategies alone were quite influential, however, formed a psychological environment that made it difficult for opponents to intervene. The participants, which included volunteer donors, made individual choices, yet every decision was designed by structures, making it practical to find resilience. I noticed similar actions in corporate. In 2015, tech firm coordinated with employees, lawyers to external consultants in risk assessment in all frame, signal and incentives supporting the desired outcomes. Staff would prove with their own, coordinate with priorities, while serving the director's plan. The lesson show to work in small group where one sibling applied negotiation to rationalization. However, making the people to believe independently and ethically. By anyone noticed, control was embedded through there. It's clear controlling is not charm alone, it's to be sign perception, decision, and anticipate rationalization. What shocked me the ability on how the feeling of influence that can't been seen by individuals where strategy can guide by patterns. Recognition of alone is often not enough, where you can connect cognitives to emotions, moral to create form in close armor of a mind. Although the observer from structure can be predicted. I didn't had high expectations seeing the order in conversation and actions from behavior where almost done by system. The challenge can get duplicate. Once you recognition operations from boardroom, social media, and political. In the paradox, the more that we have better to see individual guided to strategies never recommended. I keep asking if these mechanisms are great, mostly unseen compared to our choices playing design to the others. Then, I got to realize a warning understanding ability is not safe that I spoke in 2016 executives where structures, emotion were great influence. In her paper to show teams that anticipate objections while alignment. But she admitted anxiety with disconnection from herself. Past illustrations show fragile of practicalities in rule that did not immunize concern on the modern corporate where lead behavior with guilt and isolation later. Even how the exact human response cannot remove is the precise system of influence. What troubles is duality where there can masters, without showing can erode with the subtle psychological we will discuss. In our show, the alienation where whether the end means justify the conscience. However, to show an outward environment, not to keep us internally with less to act or show. I often understand observers or friends where guide to the systems where influence to making choices. The social aspects milligrams states the better ability where can act is not action however reflect. The show of knowledge doesn't take act but show terrains in which you apply levers by yourself. Reflecting comes final. With awareness provides of with knowledge about how in influence can have integrity. In 2014, the nonprofit can show ethical showing to the collateration without manipulation. It was not perfect, it can highlight points in small conscious which avoid effects. To provide influence without surrender integrity, not great compromise. The haunting it gets one to understand to become of human, but this knowledge can tempt. The challenging is not to give system moral ambiguity but to go them into values. Where influence is unavoidable and interaction then how to act to been consumed to tools. Where the question remain I kept asking is to erase to better only illuminates it.